For years, the idea of China speed was sold as a modern miracle. Sleek trains cutting across the country, massive stations rising out of nowhere, and a rail system growing faster than any before it were presented as proof that China had mastered scale, efficiency, and destiny itself. High-speed rail was not merely transportation. It was a moving symbol of national power and political competence. With more than 50,000 kilometers of track, the majority of the world's total, the narrative seemed unassailable. But that story is now unraveling, revealing a system weighed down by debt, compromised construction, and demographic decline rather than unstoppable progress. As the spectacle fades, the reality beneath it is impossible to ignore. What once looked like momentum now resembles a financial and structural burden that can no longer be concealed. The network is riddled with stress points, not only in concrete and steel, but in balance sheets and population trends. Questioning this reality has never been encouraged. Analysts who challenge official optimism are sidelined, reports quietly disappear, and unfavorable data is buried. Yet physical decay does not respond to censorship, and debt does not dissolve because it is inconvenient. From the beginning, the high-speed rail campaign was never purely about mobility. It was a political mobilization built on the assumption that construction itself equaled success. Over 2 decades, tracks were laid far ahead of real demand, fueled by the belief that future growth would inevitably justify present excess. In a short span of 5 years, more than $500 billion was poured into lines, stations, bridges, and tunnels. Instead of rising ridership paying the bills, liabilities expanded even faster. By 2024, the debt carried by China State Railway Group had swollen into what economists describe as a gray rhino crisis, massive, obvious, and impossible to outrun. The underlying problem is straightforward and unforgiving. Most of these rail lines were never designed to be profitable. They existed to boost local GDP figures and enhance officials' promotion prospects. Feasibility studies were optimistic at best, sometimes fictional at worst. While dissenting voices were brushed aside, only a handful of routes linking major hubs such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou can cover their costs. The rest operate in permanent deficit. Today, I'd say around 94% of the network loses money, with interest payments alone consuming tens of billions of dollars each year before maintenance is even considered. Maintenance, however, can no longer be postponed. As traffic accumulates and systems age, repair costs are accelerating, especially where construction was rushed or corrupted. With local governments crippled by the real estate collapse, the old strategy of borrowing to expand has reached its limit. The financial cushions are gone, and the structural weaknesses are exposed. Even more troubling is what lies beneath the rails. Tofu-dreg construction has long plagued China's infrastructure, and high-speed rail has not escaped it. Officially, these tracks were engineered to extreme precision, built with materials meant to endure decades of high-speed vibration. In practice, when corners were cut, high-quality inputs were replaced with cheaper alternatives, industrial waste substituted for proper materials, and inspections treated as box-ticking exercises. The consequences are now visible. After little more than a decade, sections of track are already deteriorating. Cracked slabs, fractured steel reinforcements, failing bonding layers, and decaying waterproof systems. Structures meant to last a century are aging like temporary pavement. What makes these findings impossible to dismiss is their origin. They are not the claims of foreign critics, but admissions from within the railway system itself. Internal audits quietly acknowledge that projects once hailed as lasting 1,000 years were failing in 10. Instead of triggering public reckoning, these revelations were buried in dense technical language and obscure reports, but the damage continues regardless. The myth of China's speed is no longer accelerating forward. It is slowing under the weight of its own contradictions. Some of the most serious failures are hidden out of sight, deep underground. On key high-speed routes, tunnels that consumed enormous sums were flawed almost from the moment they were completed. Concrete linings were poured thinner than required, gaps between rock walls and tunnel shells were never properly filled, and groundwater intrusion became routine. In several locations, trains engineered for speeds above 300 kilometers per hour were forced to slow to a crawl because the tunnels themselves posed safety risks. At that point, the economic logic collapses entirely. A high-speed system that moves slower than road transport defeats its own purpose. The decay was not limited to major structures. Even minor components critical to safety were compromised. Shock-absorbing pads meant to reduce vibration were swapped for recycled waste. Concrete curing periods were shortened to satisfy political deadlines, permanently weakening load-bearing elements. When columns cracked or sections failed, officials initially blamed rain, temperature swings, or geological conditions, until testing revealed concrete that disintegrated like powder, rather than fracturing like properly cured material. These outcomes were not accidents. They were the predictable result of corner cutting. Above ground, the consequences are easier to see. Across the country, vast, high-speed rail stations sit abandoned, sealed, or never officially opened. Built far from urban centers to reduce land costs and gamble on future expansion, they now stand isolated amid empty fields. The expected cities never arrived. Passengers never came. Yet even without travelers, these structures continue to consume public money year after year simply to guard, light, and maintain them. They are not symbols of modernization, but of overreach. Natural conditions have only intensified the risks. In northern China, decades of excessive groundwater extraction have caused widespread land subsidence. Entire rail corridors are slowly sinking, unevenly. When different sections settle at different rates, track alignment is compromised, forcing permanent speed limits. The very advantage used to justify the investment disappears. Satellites can easily detect this subsidence from orbit, but correcting it on the ground is vastly more complex and costly. Financially, the system has entered a trap. New loans are increasingly used to service old interest. Claims of profitability rely on subsidies quietly shuffled between government accounts. When ticket prices were raised sharply, ridership dropped instead of rising. Migrant workers and low-income travelers abandoned high-speed trains for slower, cheaper options, further hollowing out demand. Demographics offer no relief. An aging population and declining birth rates mean fewer passengers in the future, not more. By 2026, the era of relentless expansion has ended. New projects have slowed or stopped entirely. What remains is consolidation, reduced speeds, yet quiet route suspensions, and deferred maintenance. The high-speed rail system did not collapse overnight. It is bending gradually under accumulated weight, year by year, defect by defect. What was once presented as proof of a flawless development formula now poses an uncomfortable question. If the most celebrated achievement of China's speed cannot sustain itself, what does that imply about the countless other projects built under the same logic? At the provincial level, the debt burden has grown impossible to conceal. Local governments borrowed aggressively, often tens or hundreds of billions of yuan, to secure rail projects without possessing the revenue to repay them. Borrowing became circular. New loans used to cover old obligations. On paper, the lines are in operation. In reality, cash flow has collapsed. Some routes run only a few trains per day, generating income that fails to cover even electricity costs. As provincial finances deteriorate, high-speed rail debt has become a silent but extremely dangerous time bomb. Meanwhile, a surreal landscape of excess and abandonment has spread nationwide. Massive stations rise from empty land with no passengers in sight. Some lines were completed but never fully launched. Others opened briefly and were quietly shut down due to lack of demand. Construction costs were spent up front, but security and maintenance expenses continue indefinitely. These projects produce no real economic value, only concrete, steel, and compounding interest. The promise that development would follow the tracks proved false. Instead, ghost stations and rail-linked dead zones now define large stretches of the landscape. The consequences are already visible. In multiple regions, rail investment companies have effectively defaulted, unable to meet interest payments on time. Salaries have been cut, maintenance delayed, and operational safety increasingly strained. Local governments seek bailouts from the center or conceal financial data to prevent panic. But debt does not vanish because it is hidden. With land sales collapsing and fiscal revenues shrinking, high-speed rail has become a lethal financial burden. Provinces are trapped in a no-win dilemma. Building further deepens losses, while stopping exposes the scale of past failures. This is no longer a localized issue. It is a systemic crisis. Ultimately, China's high-speed rail crisis is not just a story about trains, tracks, or tunnels, but it is a mirror reflecting a deeper development model built on urgency over sustainability, appearances over fundamentals, and political incentives over economic logic. When speed becomes the goal itself, quality, safety, and long-term viability are inevitably sacrificed. The rail network did not fail because the technology was impossible, but because the system behind it rewarded shortcuts and punished caution. What remains today is not a symbol of progress, but a warning about what happens when scale replaces substance. The myth did not collapse from external pressure, it collapsed from internal contradictions. In that sense, high-speed rail is only the most visible crack in a much larger structure. The same logic shaped housing, infrastructure, local finance, and industrial expansion across China. If even the regime's most celebrated showcase project cannot escape debt, decay, and demographic reality, then no sector built under the same rules is truly safe. The era of limitless building has ended, replaced by an era of reckoning. What China now faces is not a temporary slowdown, but a structural question it can no longer outrun. How to unwind a development model that worked on paper, looked impressive on camera, but ultimately ignored the limits of economics, engineering, and society itself.